What's up guys, welcome back to the channel and to another weekly 3D model. For this week's video, we're going to be doing things a little bit different than usual. Rather than your typical time-lapse and speed modeling video, which I know can be a little bit challenging for beginners to follow along and see exactly what I'm doing and the reasons why, I thought we would slow things down this week and I can do more of a full walkthrough from modeling to UVing and texturing and go through the full process at a much slower speed, which will hopefully be a lot easier to follow along and understand what I'm doing. So for this week's model, I wanted to do something that was a little bit easier and didn't have a lot of difficult parts, but still covered a lot of different things that we can go over in this sort of walkthrough. So I thought a control panel would be fitting, so I hopped on Google and did some searching and I came across these two images. The first image is from Ali Raham and it's an emergency switch, and I really love this piece of art. He did a really great job, and I thought it'd be fun to take some of these parts from the model and just replicate them into the one that we're going to create. And the second image, I don't know the artist's name, so if anybody does, let me know and I'm going to add it in the description. But I also thought that this was pretty cool looking and I wanted to take parts from both models to create our own. So without me dragging this video on anymore, let's just get started. So to start things off, I'm going to select the cube and we can start blocking out all the main shapes. Now I'm not going to worry too much about the little details, let's just start blocking it out to get the main shape and then we can move on to all the other little things afterwards. Basically, I'm just figuring out exactly the size I want this whole control panel to be. Now I'm working on a different computer, so I don't have my tool settings up, so I'm just going to click any of these icons on the left, double click them, and then I can just drag this right on beside my outliner. That way when I go insert some edge loops, I can easily switch between equal and multiple depending on how many I want to add into this object. So we're going to start just by adding in our own at different places. I'm going to start blocking out basically the blueprint of where I want this switch to go. So let's start adding some edge loops and then we can start adding in that shape. Now I don't have to be too worried about getting these perfectly off the start. We can just roughly start blocking things out and then we can always modify the shape afterwards. So once I'm happy with those, I can go select all of these faces that I want to delete so we can add our little imprint where we want this whole lever to go. Now I don't want it running up right to the edge there, so I'm just going to add an extra edge loop on the end and then we can reselect these faces, delete them, I can double click those edges and then just extrude them downwards. And just like that, now we have our imprint where we want our whole lever to go. So now I just want to start basically filling in this back face, and there's a few ways. Just I'm going to do this with the append to polygon tool. I can click on some edges. I can also just basically extrude a certain edge like I do here, and then using the target weld tool I can combine those vertices. Now the best way to do this is honestly adding just a large single plane in the back. That way it's very low in polys, it just has 4 vertices, and you're not really going to see these faces. So for the sake of this little tutorial here, I'm just kind of filling in this back face like so, but it's not really necessary. You can just add one simple plane and that way you have less polys in your scene. So now that all those faces are filled in, I can start just moving around these vertices to finalize this shape before we start moving forward. Alright, so now that we have that whole lever sort of blocked out, we can start planning the other side of our model. And I want to have a big screen on the top, so start moving some of these edges. That way I can select those faces, delete them, and just double click those edges and extrude them down. And then I'm just going to fill in this hole, and with the multi-cut tool, I'm just going to attach those 2 vertices. We want to try to keep this model in quads if possible. We do end up using some triangles, but you want to try to always stay in quads if you can. So now I'm just trying to plan out where we want these buttons to go right below. So let's go create a button. I'm going to do that with creating another cube. You can scale that nice and small. And then just position that roughly right on top of our little control panel. So I'm going to go ahead and select all of these edges and add a small bevel to them. And I was trying to figure out exactly how I wanted this button to look, but we're just going to keep it very simple, just a simple cube, and go with this. So I was about to just duplicate this object, but I thought we should do it the proper way and just UV it ahead of time rather than coming back to doing that afterwards. So let's just go ahead and focus on this one little button. We're going to delete that bottom face because it's not really necessary. I can go ahead and open my UV editor. And then I can just do an automatic UV, but as you can see here in the transform, all the positions are still here, so everything's squared. So we're just gonna have to freeze our transformations, which is gonna zero all those out. That way when I go and do an automatic UV, everything looks properly like it really should. And the great thing about an automatic UV is it's gonna cut it. It's a simple cube, so it's gonna work in our favor. And that way it's gonna separate that top face, which we wanna add different numbers to later on. So we're just gonna go with this for now. I can just drag these UVs to the side on my UV map, and we'll come back to them later when we want to finish these off. So now I'm just trying to plan exactly where I want these buttons to fit. I want to have a little extrude, just like we did to the screen and the lever. We want to have a little extrusion into this control panel where these buttons are going to fit. So I'm just going to add another edge loop and try to plan out exactly where I want this cube to go. Once I'm happy with that, select those faces, delete them, double click the edge and extrude it downwards. And once again with the multi-cut tool, let's just attach those two vertices. Alright, so that's looking pretty good. Now I can start just fitting these buttons a little bit better into this area. So we want to have a row of 12 buttons, and I can just select all of these, group them together, and I'm just going to center it inside of this little area. And don't forget to name your folders inside of your outliner. And like I mentioned, we can come back to this afterwards, so I'm just going to select all these UVs and drag them to the side, and we can position them later on when we have other objects in our scene. Alright, so things are looking good. Let's just keep working on this shape. So on the bottom here, it's looking too flat. I thought it'd be nice having a little indent like that first reference photo we were looking at. So I'm just going to delete those faces, extrude this one edge downwards, try to line it up with the other model, and then I can just extrude it once again to match up with this side. And using that target weld tool, I can just combine or attach these vertices. And then all I'll have to do here is just double click two edges and bridge them together to fill in these two holes on the sides. Alright, so now that's looking good. I can just double click this outside edge and extrude that downwards just to give it a little bit more depth. Alright, so next up is working on that top bar. Now I don't have my align tool on my shelf, so let's go ahead and go into the menus here to the align tool, double click all these, go to last selected object, and I can apply. Now I just want to go back into my menu, hold Control Shift, and I can click on that tool and it'll just attach it to my top shelf there. That way when I click on an object I can just align it to the center. I always do this and keep it on my shelf. It makes my workflow that much easier, so I definitely recommend doing that. So back to this shape, let's start modeling and blocking out this top bar that's going to sit on the top of this control panel. Now once again, not worrying too much about the shape, we're going to come back to it when we start adding other things, but let's just get it in that place so we can start picturing where we want things to go. So now I'm just going to double click this outside edge and extrude it once again. I just want some screws to sit on the corners, so I need to create a little edge for them to sit on. And then we can make sure that that top bar is just not intersecting with that object, so we can move that up a little bit to fit a little bit better with that model. Alright, so now taking a look at everything just to see how things are looking and trying to plan out where we want to jump to next. Now I noticed that there's an edge loop in the middle of this handle that we don't need, so I can just double click that and Control Delete. If you can save on polys, it's always a good thing, so let's just remove that. And now we can start planning out this handle object. So let's start with a cube. We can fit it into this little area here and start blocking out this shape. Now I don't exactly know how I want to go about this, so we're just kind of experimenting along the way, not thinking too hard. I don't need to get it perfect off the start. Like I always say, you can just start playing around with shapes and it slowly comes together. So what I'm doing is basically thinking I want to have like two edges on the sides that come up, so I'm just going to add some edge loops and then I can just start extruding those faces upwards. That way this lever has a little area to go into, so I'm just playing around with that, trying to imagine how I want this to look. Once again, I am using that first reference as guidance. I really like how that model looks, so I basically just copy it. So I'm just trying to block out these shapes and get them into place. Now I am using these little guides, these edge loops we created as just a guidance for these shapes as well. So I want it to all fit inside these areas. That way when we start extruding other faces, and everything fits nicely because we're using these as our guides. Alright, so those two cylinders are in place. I can go ahead and select all of these faces in the back and just drag them downwards to create some more depth for this handle to fit into. Alright, so now we can create the handle of our little lever. So I can select some of these faces, delete them, double click that edge and just extrude it outwards. Then I can use that scale tool just to make it nice and flat. And I can start fitting it right where I want this, or start imagining at least where I want this handle to go. I'm still trying to figure out exactly how it's going to fit together, but it's slowly coming together. So let's go ahead and double click these edges. I can bridge them together so I can cap off this mesh. And then I can select these other faces and extrude those outwards. So I'm just trying to create some more shape to this handle. Once again, using that first image that I shared as our reference photo. Now I'm just going to duplicate that cylinder over so I can just scale it to combine, basically attach these two sides together where the main handle piece is going to be. And it was looking a little bit short, so we're just going to zoom out, select all these vertices and just drag it up a little bit just to make it a little bit bigger. And now things are looking a little bit better. Alright, so now it's starting to make a little bit more sense now I'm looking at it. I basically need this handle to fit right between those two faces that we extruded from that bottom square. So I'm just going to move these vertices outwards a little bit, that way it has a little bit of an area to fit into. And I can just drag this handle a little bit more further down. So I'm just going to basically grab that edge, give it a bevel just to round it out, and now I just need a little area here. Rather than extruding it all the way down, I should have extruded it only halfway. So we're just going to add an edge loop, that way I can delete all those faces and basically just select two of those edges and bridge them together. And that way we can fill the bottom of this out and it has a little area for this handle to fit into. Now it's looking a little bit better. We're just going to change the shape a little bit more, but now it's making a little bit more sense. And now we can zoom out and take a quick look at the model. Now the model's looking a little bit better, but as I'm looking back, I'm just realizing it's looking a little bit too flat. So what we want to do is just add an extra edge loop on this side to separate these two, basically the right side from the left. And I can go ahead and select all of these faces and extrude them upwards. It's just going to create a little bit more depth in this model. I find if things are looking a little bit too flat, it looks a little bit too plain, and that way it'll just make the model hopefully look a little bit more interesting. So now that we extruded those faces, let's go to this top bar and we can just drag this up as well and make it a little bit higher as well, so we have some different levels of depth. And once again, like I mentioned, it just makes it look a little bit more interesting, at least I think so. And then we can double click those two edges on the outside of the bar and give them a nice little bevel and then match it up with the other meshes. And once again, keeping things in low poly really helps you create the model and start moving things around much easier rather than having a lot of polys in your scene. So now I just want to create a little bit of, it's looking a little bit too wide where that handle is. I want to just extrude those faces, so I'm just going to select those faces on each side of this handle and I can extrude them just to make it a little bit more snug up against the other mesh. It's looking good. I just think the handle needs a little bit more of an area around it so you can actually fit your fingers in to pull it if you had to in an emergency. So let's go ahead and select those vertices and we can just pull them out a little bit more. Now with a lot of these edges you can go and clean up your model, and just using the scale tool I just make them all straight, and it's a really good habit to get into, is keeping all of your topology nice and clean. And if you spend a lot of time doing that, you can make things look a lot better. So I'm just going over and just selecting some of these vertices and scaling them nice and straight. Now I'm just doing it really quickly. Obviously you should spend a little bit more time making it really nice, and it's going to make your model flow a lot better. All these edges won't be really close together. It's just going to flow really nicely, and it's going to help your textures when you go into the texturing part. So we'll come back to this when we do the UVing and clean it up a little bit more. Alright, so now back to the handle. I do want to create a little area like a reference photo where it's just cut out. You can see a little pole that's basically connecting this handle where the pivot point would be. So we're just going to add a few edge loops so I can create that little area. I can go ahead and just select all those faces and delete them. So now if I isolate this object, you can see how he's deleted all those faces. So now I can just select these two edges, bridge them together so we have that little cutout in our object. Now eventually we're going to delete a lot of those faces below because they're just not going to be seen, and it's good to just remove those unnecessary polys and faces in your model that aren't going to be viewed. But for now we're not going to worry about that. We're just going to fill in this hole by extruding some edges, and then I can just double click these two outside holes and fill them. And just like that, we have our little cutouts. Now I can just add a tiny little cylinder that's going to fit in there to act as a little screw or a little bolt. That's basically the little hinge point, the pivot point in that handle model. Alright, so let's just make sure everything is nice and snug, and then we can keep working on this handle. Alright, so now we can isolate this handle. We can work on a few things. So the first thing we want to do is fix this six-sided face. So we want to use that multi-cut tool so we can start attaching some of these vertices together. Now it's okay to have some triangles, like situations like this is honestly alright, but you want to try to obviously keep it towards quads if you can. So now that we have those fixed, we can double click all these edges and we can give them a nice little bevel. Now by increasing the segments, we're going to have to add a few extra edge loops so we can fix these other polys since they're more than four-sided now. So I'm just going to create an edge loop on the top here, and then using that multi-cut we can just attach them together, and then I can double click it, scale it so to make sure it's nice and straight. And then using that same multi-cut tool we can attach a vertice to basically create two four-sided faces rather than one that's six-sided. And then same thing to the bottom here as well. Now we're going to end up removing a lot of those faces on the bottom, but for now just want to show you exactly how I would go about that. And same thing for the side here, we just want to add an edge loop that goes all the way around so we can connect to have some faces that are not more than four-sided. And same with here, we'll connect these later on in the UVing process, but it's looking good enough for now, so let's just go ahead and start beveling out some more edges. Now you have to be careful with your selecting of edges. I obviously missed some, which I will show you in a little bit. Just make sure you have all of those edges selected before you go ahead and bevel them. So same thing, I just want to increase those segments up to 2, that way it's nice and rounded. And if you look on the side here, rather than fixing all these vertices, I'm just gonna click that edge as well to give it a nice bevel. That way those just will have some nice edge flow and we won't have to worry about connecting things and fixing those non-four-sided faces. But we do have to add that multi-cut tool and just connect these faces here. Now like I mentioned earlier, I did forget that bevel, so once again make sure you select all your edges before beveling, and then we can worry about connecting those other vertices later on. I'm just doing this fairly quick. I was trying to keep this model under an hour with UVs, and we do end up going above that, but so I'm trying to rip through this as quick as I can. But work slow, make sure you get everything done properly, and it's gonna save you time probably in the end. So right now I just tried cutting it in half, assuming that I probably could get away with not seeing half the model, but you could see the top here, so I'm just gonna delete just the end pieces. And I find if you're not going to animate it and it's not going to move, there's no point of having those faces hiding behind the other geometry. It's just going to add unnecessary polys to your scene, so we can basically remove most of them. And same thing for this bottom piece, where it's going to select all of those edges, unselect the ones that aren't on the actual edge, and then once that's looking good, we can give it a nice bevel as well. Alright, so things are looking good. We can go and just finish off some other bevels on these other objects. I tried copying over that same bevel value from the previous bevel, but since it's had some work done to it, it just didn't retain that exact information, so I just have to manually adjust that slider so it looks relatively close to the other one. And we're looking good. So now this little face where the screen is looking a little bit deep, so we're just going to select those faces and bring it up. And just taking a quick look to see if there's anything we want to fix before moving on to beveling out some more edges. But I think it's looking pretty good, so let's go ahead and start doing that. So I'm basically going to select all of these edges. I'm going to work on this little handle area first, and we can start beveling it out. So once we add a bevel, we're going to move the segments up to 2 once again, but we will have to go in and clean it up a little bit. That way they're not more than 4-sided, so we're going to go through with that multi-cut tool, delete some of those edges, and then start reattaching some. And I come back and further refine it, but for now we're just going to really quickly just start attaching some of these, and also straightening some of these edges out. Like I mentioned, take your time and really straighten everything out. It's just going to make everything flow much better, and your model will look much better in the end. Now we want to go with that multi-cut tool like I mentioned and start attaching all of these non-4-sided faces. A really easy way, since we only added one segment, is just basically just cutting it in half, and you're gonna split it from 6 sides to 4. Alright, so that's looking good. Now we can move on to the other bevels on the outside of the model. So let's go ahead and start double clicking those edges, and then we can add another bevel to them. Once again, make sure that you're clicking all of the edges. I was doing this a little bit too quick and I ended up missing a couple more once again. So take your time. There's no point rushing and then having to redo work. Alright, so things are looking good. We will have to go in with that multi-cut tool and start attaching some vertices, but I'm just taking a little closer look at these small areas to make sure that nothing's looking a little wacky and out of place. So now we can bevel out this little screen area and the top bar as well. I always find once you add the bevels, the models start looking much better. You start seeing that nice reflection around the edges and the shading from just working in the UV port. It always looks much better, and it always starts getting exciting for me when I'm done beveling a few things. So now it's time to move on to that little card strip I wanted to add on the side. Got this idea from that second reference photo. I thought it'd be cool adding a little object on the side to make it a little more interesting. So starting off with the cube, block that out, add a small bevel to it. So I was trying to figure out exactly where I want that actual card, like that cut to go where you slide your card through. So I decided right down the middle would be nice. So what we're going to do is add 2 edge loops right down the middle, and just go over to my modeling menu over here on the right, and I can switch my transform constraint to edge. That way I can slide those 2 edges along and I'm not going to mess around with the shape. Now I have those 2 edge loops, I can take those 2 outside faces and extrude them upwards. That way I have a little area where my key card can actually swipe through. Alright, so now that's looking a little bit better. I'm just going to go modify the shape a little bit, and then we can start beveling out some of these edges. I'm just going to select all of those edges, unselect the ones that are on faces, and then I can give it a nice bevel similar to the other objects in our scene. And once again, increase no segments, you'll have to go in with the multi-cut tool and just attach some of those vertices to try to create some faces that are less than, well, ideally four-sided. Alright, so next up is creating a few little screws and bolts. So for the bolt, we're going to create a cylinder, drag that down to 6-sided, and I can go ahead and start beveling out some of these edges. Now with bolts, you really don't need, you can get away with not having a lot of polys to them. So if you wanted to keep this on the lower poly side of things, these bevels really aren't necessary, but it always adds a little bit more realism to it, especially when the light hits that edge. It's not going to be so hard, so I always like adding bevels if it's possible. So once those edges are beveled, we can start positioning our screw on our model. Now before duplicating the screw a bunch of times, I thought it would be smart to like our buttons just to UV it ahead of time, just to save ourselves the work. So we're going to open up our UV editor, and I'm just going to do a planar projection, and I'm just going to do a cut along the bottom here, and then unfold it, which shows that something was wrong, and once again I missed another bevel. This whole model I just had a tough time with these bevels. So we're just going to Control Z that a bunch to go all the way back so I can click that extra edge and then redo those bevels. Now I didn't want those unnecessary polys in the middle, so I'm just basically going to delete the faces as well as the bottom ones, and then I can double click that top edge and just make all those points go to the center. Now it's looking a little bit better, so we can basically scale that down to fit back to where we want it. And I can go ahead and do a planar projection to remove all of those cuts on the model and just do a Control U to unfold it and Control L to lay it out. And then we have a nice bolt that's just UV'd, so we can move it and duplicate it many times as we want. We won't have to come back and redo our work. So I tried going to 4 screws and it ended up looking a little weird, so I just go back to 2 and just mess around with the scaling a little bit. But now that we did the UVs on that screw, later on I can go and start duplicating these all over the model and we won't have to go back and redo our work. Alright, so let's zoom back out and take another look at the model. Now I thought on the very bottom here there should be a little edge or something that's kind of sticks out, so we're going to go in and select some of these vertices and I can just pull those down. All I'm trying to do is just give it a little bit more shape. A good way of thinking about it is if it was a silhouette, would you be able to really tell what it is? And that sometimes if you look at it like that, the objects look a little bit too plain, so I thought in this case it would be nice adding a little small edge that kind of sticks out on the bottom. So next up is moving on to this little cutout that I made earlier, so I thought it'd be kind of fun to add some wires. I love adding wires, I always find it makes every model look cool. So we're going to add a few wires that attach to each side on the bottom of this model. So starting off with some cylinders as just a place as a way to kind of block it out to try visualizing how I want it to look. So I can go ahead and start working on one of these cylinders, and once I'm happy with it, I can just duplicate it and position it in the same place as all the other ones we created. So all I'm doing here is just cutting out a hole on the top, beveling out some edges, just creating a little area where this wire would actually come out of. So for the actual wire itself, we're going to do that with the EP Curve tool. So under the Create tab, under the Curve Tools, you'll find EP Curve tool, and we're just going to click in a couple of points depending on how I want this curve to look. And then we can just scale that nice and small and position that right over our cylinder we created earlier. And I can right click and go to the vertices and start just messing around with this wire, this line shape that we created, and just positioning each end to attach to each side of the cylinders. And once I have one that I'm happy with, I can just reuse the same cord over and over again just to create the other ones in my scene. So let's go ahead and start positioning these vertices around. That way I can turn it into a sweep mesh, and then we can create that wire. So like I said, once one is done, I can go ahead and just duplicate that same curve and then reposition those points to fit with the others, and then basically do that exact same thing once again for the third time, and then just reposition those points to fit. What I imagined in my head is that all of these wires would be attached, somehow being held in the middle there, so I'm just making sure that they all bunch together so we can add a little like torus or something to, which I'm going to do right now. and then I can just scale this torus nice and small to fit right over those wires, so something is kind of holding it onto that control panel. And I don't have to worry too much about getting the scale of the torus right. A really great way to change the size is with the transform tool, and that's right under the edit mesh. If you drag it along the X there on the blue arrow, you can just make it thicker or thinner, and it's a great way of changing the shape rather than modifying it in the attribute editor. So once I'm happy with that, I can start further adjusting these points to fit inside of that torus we created. And once things are looking pretty good, I can go to turn this curve into a sweep mesh. And all I have to do is just increase the precision and change the profile depending on how thick I want that chord to be. And once I'm happy with that, it's really simple. I can copy that exact same value and just paste it for all the other remaining curves. So let's go ahead and start creating these other remaining wires. Now once those are positioned, I can go ahead and press B on my keyboard for soft select mode, and then holding B and clicking and dragging, I can change the radius. And that's just a really easy way of further editing these wires and these curves I created to actually not intersect with each other. I want them to look realistic, like they're actually fitting in there and not, you know, going through the other geometry around it. So we're just gonna play around with these shapes a little bit to make them fit nice and snug in this little area, and then we'll move on to some other things. Alright, so that cylinder's looking good. Like I mentioned, I can start duplicating these over to put in the positions of the other first ones that I created. And just like that, we have some wires added to our scene. And once again, with that soft select tool, we can go and just mess around with these wires a little bit more just to refine them to fit properly inside of those cylinders. Alright, and that's looking pretty cool, so we can start moving on, duplicating these other screws to other areas on my model. I just want to start populating it, making it look a little bit more busy and a little more interesting to look at. Alright, so the screws are in position, and a good thing to do is just turn them, rotate them slightly, that way they're not all looking identical, especially when you start, you know, repeating that same pattern, it starts being pretty noticeable, so giving it a small rotation really adds a lot to it. Now this little area above this switch was looking, or this lever was looking a little bit bare and plain, so I'm just going to add a little cube and just delete the faces that are behind that we don't need, and I can give this a small little bevel just to kind of create an extra shape and make it hopefully a little bit more interesting on that little area that's looking a little bit plain. Alright, so things are looking good. I'm just going to start refining some of these shapes, just moving some of these vertices around to give it a little bit more space between this handle, that way it's not intersecting with any of those faces. And then same for the top bar here. After looking at it, just looked a little bit plain, and adding an extra little piece of geometry will, I think, bring it to life a little bit more. So I'm just gonna add a tiny little cube and bevel out some edges, and then just squish that nice and small to fit on that top bar on each end. Now we're almost done the modeling. I'm just going to zoom out and take another look to try to figure out exactly what we want to touch up before moving on to those UVs. Alright, so one of the things I want to do is just separate that screen from the actual piece of geometry. So I'm just going to select all of those faces, and under the Edit Mesh tab I can extract it, and that's just going to basically separate those faces from the model itself. And it's just going to be easier for me down the road when it comes to texturing to apply different materials to it, since I know that screen's going to be much different than the other meshes that are around it. So now that it's separated, I can go ahead and just squish it a little bit thinner and make it fit a little bit better in that area. And now we can go ahead and isolate that main object we have. I can just remove those two edge loops on the top since we removed that screen, they're unnecessary. And I can take another quick look at the model to see how it's looking. I'm just making sure that I haven't missed any of these weird areas. I did notice, however, that I did miss a bevel here, like I mentioned earlier. So we're just going to double click that, remove that whole edge, just so I can redo this bevel. And it just saves yourself a lot of time making sure you have it all correct before you go ahead and bevel things. And you don't have to do things like I'm doing right now and redoing my work. So we're just going to clean up this edge here. I'm just going to delete those edges. Using that multi-cut tool, I can just connect some of those vertices so the edge flow is flowing a little bit better. Now here, I do come back and fix this. I missed a 5-sided face on the other side, but we fix that soon. So let's just go ahead and start fixing a few of these other faces that I know are 6-sided. And once again missed another bevel as well, so we're just gonna delete that edge and then I can redo that bevel. I wasn't joking when I was saying I was having a tough time with bevels in this model. And back to that face I mentioned I missed, so we're just going to fix all of these edges up. Make sure they're 4-sided. And for this one I decided to add an extra edge loop just so I had a closer place to attach those vertices to, so I didn't have to basically drag them across at a further distance. It just makes everything flow a little bit better, especially because I have that real estate I can work with. I'm not limited by poly count at all, so I don't want to make it obviously crazy high in polys, but I'm not too worried about it at the same time. So I'm just trying to figure out exactly how I want this other side to fit. So let's just play around with the shape a little bit and try to figure out how this is all going to flow together. And this is bugging me to this little area, so I'm just going to fix it up, straighten out these edges, and hopefully make it flow a little bit better. And here as well, since I'm gonna separate those faces on the bottom that are underneath that lever, I'm not really worried about the polys on that bottom face, so we can make them just go right into the bottom there. Since we're going to separate them, it's not a big deal. And then a good way of just checking, if you hit 3 on your keyboard to smooth it, it's pretty obvious. If you have more than 4-sided faces, a lot of the areas will just you'll see those UVs, those edges just like fall in on each other. It's a good way of just quickly testing to see if everything's holding together nicely. And here's that area I was talking about that was bothering me, so I'm just going to add a just one edge loop that goes across the side, and we can call it a day, and I don't have to think about it too much. Now you can do this much better if you plan it and you take your time. You can probably make your topology look much better and make way more sense, but just in this case I'm trying to do it relatively quick. Now here for the bottom underneath the handle, like I said, the best way I should have went about this is just deleting all of those faces and adding one large four-sided plane that just covers the back and fills in that hole. And that way it's slow in polys, but I'm just going to play around with the shape and see if there's any faces that I can remove. So what I decided to do is just select all of those faces, and I can just extract them like we did earlier, just to separate it from the model. And then I can just treat this as its own separate object and not really worry about it too much. So now I just have a much easier object to worry about with topology and how everything flows. So all I'm doing here is just hardening these edges. Since I removed them, it's just treating it like they're softened, and I'm getting that weird shading. So all I'm doing is just double clicking and hitting harden edge. And I'm hitting G on my keyboard to repeat that last step to make my life a little bit quicker as well. So now it's looking a little bit better, everything's looking smooth, I'm not getting any weird shadings from any weird topology or different polys that are pulling and stretching different faces. I just need to finish wrapping up a few of these other objects like this, another six-sided face, so I need to, with that multi-cut tool, just add an extra little vertex connecting those 2 points. And then I'm just going to reuse that same shape that I created on the top. I'm just going to create some sort of little piece of geometry here that these wires are going into. It just looked weird going into like nothing. Having some sort of object that intersects with those 2 shapes, I find makes it a little more realistic, like it actually serves a purpose, like it's going into something. So rather than creating a shape, I'm just going to reuse the ones I already have. And that's it. That is a whole wrap on modeling. So next up, let's jump into the UVs. And this is pretty simple. I'm just going to start off with deleting the history on all the objects, removing those curves we created for the chords. And I'm just going through these folders, making sure that there's no hidden folders in there, empty folders, and I can start grouping all these objects together. So what I like to do is just start grouping all of the objects that are pretty obvious that they're grouped together. So for example, all of those buttons I'd group, this handle I'm going to group as one object, and just try to separate the main pieces of geometry. That way when I start UVing it, I can start grouping them together, and it's going to be a lot easier for me to start figuring out how I want to lay them out on my UV map. So this is just the workflow that I like to do. So let's start with just grouping everything together, and then we can start UVing things. Alright, so let's start with this top bar. Now I'm going to start off with the multi-cut tool. I'm just going to make sure that I attach these vertices. Obviously this face on the side is much more than 4, so we're just going to add an edge loop that loops all the way around and connects to the other side, and then I can just connect all of these other vertices. And just do the exact same thing to all the other corners or sides on this model. So we're just going to repeat the exact same thing to the other side now. Now sometimes I find if you look in the shading, it just looks a little weird, so just sometimes this happens. It's kind of strange, I don't even know why, but I add an extra edge loop here just to help support that side, and if you look and you zoom close, you can see the white or the shading in this viewport actually change depending on where I drag it. and I find adding an extra edge there just helps support it and it looks a little bit better. So now I'm just going to do the exact same thing I just did to the opposite side of this shape. Just reconnect those and attach all these vertices. Now I could just cut it in half, flip it around, and all that work would be done, but it's not that much. Let's go ahead and just fix up this other side. And then for that other supporting edge, I'm just gonna click the other one and bevel it. Just a nice, easy way of doing it, and I can slide that over to the other side. All right, now moving on to the other shape. Now this is the little squares that we have, so I'm just gonna go ahead and delete all of the faces on the bottom since we don't need them. In a shape like this, an automatic UV will be perfect and it'll work fine. So I'm just gonna do that to save myself a little bit of time. And then once I duplicate that object over to the other side, I can select all those UVs and just drag them off to the side. Since they're layered on top of each other, I don't wanna lose that information, and it just saves me space on my UV map if I can keep them layered. So now going back to that first shape we were working on, I'm basically just going to delete all of these faces that are on the bottom since I don't need them, and then add some UV cuts and lay them out. So I do the exact same thing for every shape that I UV. I use that 3D cut and sew UV tool, and that's just directly on the top of the page. It's actually right below my delete history button that I have on my shelf, just to the left of it. But that's basically the tool I use for all of my UVs. I start with a planar projection just so I can remove all the cuts on the model, and then I can go in with that tool afterwards and make those cuts wherever I need them. And then I just select those shells, Control U to unfold them, and Control L to lay them out. So here I realized that there's a little face, something was looking weird, and if I isolated the object, which I should have done originally, I realized there's some faces I missed. So I'm just gonna go ahead and select those faces, delete them, and then I can start just straightening these on my UV map. And then going Control U to unfold and Control L to lay it out, I can just move on to the next shape and just repeat this process over and over again. So once again, we'll do it to this shape. Just did an automatic UV, Control U and Control L to lay it out. Using those just hotkeys and those shortcuts on your keyboard really make the UVing process that much quicker. And now I can just select that group, highlight all of those UV shells, and then Control L to lay them out. That way, the textile density is going to be all the exact same on all of these objects. It's just going to make them all proportionally accurate to one another, and I just don't have to worry about that. And you can use this to your advantage in certain situations. If you want to have higher resolutions on certain objects, you can just prioritize those on your UV maps. So you can just plan around this in certain situations, but in this one, we're just going to select them all and lay them out together. So really quickly here, I just want to jump back and show you something that I didn't do. I forgot to add an edge loop since it was more than four-sided. So adding a simple line down the middle just changes this shape to being properly four-sided. So just something I want to show you. You want to remember to do that and have clean topology if you can. And the same thing for this shape that I already UV'd. You look at the sides there, they're much more than four sides. So I can either add a cut right down the side, or I can do a cut the other way like this. But in this case, I'm just gonna do it the other way like I did on the other side to keep it consistent. But you just wanna make sure that you're trying to keep those sides to at least 4 vertices. So moving on to my next group, the bolts, everything's already UV'd from before, so we don't have to worry about it. So I can move on to my next group, which is all the wires. And Sweet Mesh already gives your UVs, they already preset your UVs for you, so you just have to make sure your cuts are in the right places, but they're usually good to go. So I just highlighted them all in Control U Control L just to lay them all out. And then same with the other cylinders here. I'm just gonna UV one of them since I don't need to do them all. And then once I'm done UVing it, I can just replace them in the position of the other ones. So here, I could just leave it like this. You could use a straighten UV shells, the straighten UVs tool, which I did here, and using the optimize tool you can help spread those UVs apart and then re-straighten them, and then go back. Then you can go back to the optimize tool and then go back to straighten, kind of repeat this process and get a nice finished straightened UVs. Sometimes it's not necessary. I know some people, they always need to do it, and it's probably a good habit to do it that way anyways, because your UV maps look much cleaner. So it's a good habit to straighten your UVs, but sometimes it's not always going to benefit your model. So just take a look in the checkered board to make sure that nothing's being stretched. So once that one cylinder is done, I can just duplicate it over to the other ones, take that whole group and duplicate those over to these three. That way they're all layered on top of each other, and they just save up all that space on the UV map. So what I can do is just select them all and then just drag those UVs over on my UV map, so later on when I start piling all those UV shells together, I know that those are going to be stacked together properly. So once again, moving on to this other shape, since it's a pretty simple shape, I can do an automatic UV, and I wasn't really happy with it, so all I'm doing is just recutting exactly where I want those cuts to be. I don't need any cuts along those top faces there. They're unnecessary, so I can just cut off the sides, and I'm pretty happy with that. And then reposition them, straighten them as best as I can on my UV map, Control L to lay them all out. And now that whole group is basically done. So now I can just highlight that whole group and just reposition them. Now I don't want to Control L everything, that way all the stacks will be messed up, so I can just manually select all of my shells and then reposition them close together. So we'll throw this to the side for now. We're going to move on to our next group and continuing the UVing process. So to these buttons, I just thought it would be better to have two extra larger buttons on the bottom, so I can just duplicate those over and scale them up. I'm not changing the shape at all, so it's not going to matter for the UVs, and just going to add a little extra something to the bottom there. So I just noticed that my screen wasn't straightened. Now before tackling this object, it's good to make sure that everything's fine before you do your UVing process. So if I did the UVs ahead of time and wanted to change that position of that screen, I'd be stretching all of those faces. So make sure that you're happy with the shape, and once you're happy with it, you can start UVing it. So next up is moving on to that lever. Lever, I think it's lever, but either way, we're moving on to the lever. And I'm going to delete some more faces that are below. We don't need them since they're going to be hidden, so just to save room, as well as half of this cylinder. We can just cut it in half, we don't need it. We're not animating it or anything like that, so as well as the sides, we can remove those as well. So I'm just looking at the model, making sure it looks fine, doing a quick save. So I'm just hitting 3 on my keyboard, doing a couple smooths to make sure that there's nothing I'm missing. Once again, it's a good way of just testing, because it'll be pretty obvious if there's something wrong with your mesh. And it's like, if there's a 6-sided face, you'll see some of those UVs or those lines just bending weirdly. So, and just like under the lever, we could have just added a simple 4-sided plane as the bottom face here, but I wanted to add some nice little bevels around this edge. So all I'm going to do is just extrude it and then merge it to the center. And taking another quick look at the model just to make sure I'm happy with it. So let's jump back to that lever and we can start UVing it. So I'm going to start with the bottom shape here. We can make sure to delete history, center, pivot, and freeze transformations. And then I can just do an automatic UV on a shape like this. A lot of the square shapes, the automatic UVs work pretty well. Unless you need those cuts to be in certain areas, automatics are pretty great. And once again, just making sure I don't have any more than 4-sided faces. So using that multi-cut tool, I can just attach some extra vertices. All right, we're looking good. So moving on to the next, this is just a regular rectangle. So I can just unfold it, Control U, and lay it out. And then quickly move on to the next one. Once again, just attach these points. Make sure that you don't have any faces that are more than 4 sides. and that's looking good, so we can start doing some cuts. Now, I do come back later on and I will show you exactly what I do with this, but we're just going to quickly add some cuts to this and start figuring out where I want those to go. So I always try to cut along the edges in a perfect world if you can, so it made sense to cut it along those edges so they're hidden, as well as these edges on the front here. Now I end up removing some more faces. Like I said, I will go over this because it looked a little bit messy, and when I was done the model and I was looking at it, this is just one thing that I rushed and I could have done better. So I do come back and I will show you. So like I mentioned, I rushed this and I feel like I could have done it better. So this is just fast forwarded. I just want to show you. If you look at this UV map, you can see how it's curved here in the bottom left. And that's just because I didn't straighten it. And this could have easily been avoided just by adding a simple straighten UVs to it. Now, you will have to go in with that optimize tool and make sure that it can easily mess up your shape by straightening it. So you want to make sure that, you know, you're not ruining it by straightening it. But as you can see, just by doing that and with the optimize tool, it looks much straighter. And I can actually now go to the UV shell and do another straighten on top of that, and it just looks nice and perfect. So get in the habit of trying to do that if you can. It just makes your UV shells look much better, and you actually save a lot of space in your UV map on top of that, because you can, you know, use Tetris skills and piece these squares together much easily. So once again, this is how it was, just to show you. But I'll just leave it like that. Definitely an area I could have improved, as well as the bottom here. I want to quickly show you this. If you look at this area and we zoom in the checkered board, you can see how it's stretching. And I could have just deleted a lot of these faces, which I'm going to do right now. So I just missed this, but these faces aren't even in view, they're hidden below. So if I unhide this, you can see it doesn't matter me removing those faces, and it's actually going to help the shape when I cut it. So since this has this weird little edge, I'm going to do a little cut along the side. And one up the side here, and I can remove that first cut that we made. And that's just going to separate the side little face. So if I go back to the shell and I go Control U just to unfold it, it actually unfolds properly. You're not having any weird stretches or anything along those lines. And this is really just how I should have done it ahead of time. So the one area in my model that I wasn't too happy with, and once again, see, I did a straighten UV shell and it actually ruined the model. It makes it look worse. So at the top there, you can see how it's rounded, and if I hit straighten UVs, it's just not going to give it that proper shape like it actually has. Like it's trying to do something that's actually incorrect when it's trying to be smart. So that straighten UVs only works, it works most of the time, but just pay attention to a lot of those curved shapes because it will ruin those for you. And in this case, it's just better for me to keep it unstraightened and just unfolded. All right, so now jumping back to where we were in our UV map, I can start just messing around with these other UVs. So the same process, I'm just deleting history, freeze transformation, and center pivot, and then Control U and Control L to unfold and layout. And then I can select all that shape to handle, Control L to lay all of those shapes together, and they're all going to be proportionally accurate, have the same textile density to one another on the UV maps. Now moving on to the little chip card swiper on the side, it's going to remove some of those UVs or some of those edges, and I can go manually with that multi-cut tool and just attach them to have some nice edge flow. So this is the part that I usually cut out of my YouTube videos just because it's the same process over and over again. But it is helpful to definitely see how I'm doing it, and that's exactly why I thought for this week's video we would just incorporate this. So for these buttons, I'm just going to select all of those faces and lay those out, and that way all the other parts of the buttons that are on the side will be overlapping and saving space in that UV map, and then all the faces on the very top will be separated because we want to have individual numbers on top of them. So that's how I did the buttons, and I think this is the last object that we have to UV is this main shape. So I'm going to start by doing a planar projection to remove all those cuts, and I can start adding my own manual cuts around the edges. So here I'm just making some extra cuts on the corners just to save space in my UV map. I don't want a long strip. And here as well, I could have done a better job with the UVs or the modeling here, but I just did it really quickly and merged it to the center. So it's a little bit messy. But we're trying to work fast. We just are approaching an hour and I was hoping to be wrapped up the model by now. So we're just trying to enter speed mode so we can finish this guy up. So I just added an extra little cut along the bottom. I'm basically just zooming out, trying to figure out exactly where I want these cuts to go. And this will also benefit you when it comes to the texturing process, depending on where you want those textures to be applied. If you do your cuts properly, it makes applying those materials much easier because you can just select UV shells and apply the materials that way. And it just makes the texturing process, I find, much easier if you start planning out where you want those shells to go. For example, here I'm doing some cuts along the side because I know I want that back area to be separated. I want it to be a different color than the other metal that I'm going to have on the top. So if you just plan out your model, it can save you a lot of time when it comes to texturing. So here I'm just doing an unfold to see how things are looking, and this shape was looking a little bit bent, so I do a couple different things here. This guy, for example, was looking weird, so I decided to just separate this little indent from the whole piece of geometry on my UV map. So I'm just trying to think about exactly where I want those cuts to go. And then I end up just choosing, like, just to make my life easy, I'll just cut it on the front and separate it. Now I can unfold again to see how the shapes are looking. And then this shape, for example, was acting weird and I didn't know why it was bending so much, and that's just because I didn't look underneath it when I was removing faces, and I find out soon that I have some extra faces. So I just did a cylindrical UV projection, thinking that maybe this would solve my problem, but all of these little edges were overlapping, so I just highlight all of those vertices in that area and unfold those, and that shows me the error that I have in this model. So when I'm looking at it, I'm just like, what is that face? And then I finally look under it, which for some reason I didn't do earlier, and I see that there's some extra faces. So I'm just gonna go ahead and delete those, and then when I unfold my shape, it will be much better. And it won't give me a weird bend, and I can even straighten this further like we did earlier with the optimize tool and just like straighten it to save some more space. But for now that will do, and we can keep looking at these other ones. So I'm just manually just changing the rotations so they fit a little bit nicer on my UV map. And I'm realizing these top ones as well aren't that straight, and we fixed that pretty easily. So just laying them out to see how they're looking and throwing on the checkerboard. And honestly, like, we could get away with this, but I was having some weird stretches actually here, so I wasn't happy with it. So I tried making a cut along the side just to see if for some reason that would fix it. So I'm doing a Control L or Control U to unfold, and I still see some weird stretches, and I'm not sure exactly what was causing that. So I was trying to just zoom in to see maybe there's some weird faces or something. So what I decided to do was just do a planar projection on the Y direction. That way it's nice and flat, and if I go open my UV map, you can see it's nice and square. So all I have to do is just scale it to be nice and thin, and I can use that checkered board image as my reference to try to get it as close to a perfect square as I could, and then I know it's relatively correct. That way I don't have to Control U and unfold it, and it won't give me those weird rounded corners. So same thing with this side as well, just doing a planar projection, and just making my model look a little bit more clean. I save a little bit of room on my UV map, and I'm getting no weird stretches in my checkered board image. So this is another one I could have fixed. So I'd start straightening a couple of these shells that I know I can, that are just already pretty straight, just to polish them up a little bit, just Now doing another unfold and straighten some of these shells out. Now this is an area that I did skip. You could go through and straighten all of these, and you know, with that optimized brush you can just really clean up those UVs. Now I just did it fairly quickly, so bear with me. I am trying to do it pretty quick. But it was good enough for this, and same with this screen. I'm going to do another planar projection just to get it nice and straight. And same with this bottom piece, I'm just going to do another planar projection. And as I zoom in, you can see that I have all these weird vertices, so I'm just going to isolate that and clean it up. Once again, I could have just put a simple plane in the background for this, which I really should have done, but then I don't have all those extra little polys and vertices making those like rounded corners. It's just unnecessary, and this is just one thing that I honestly just skip on. I should have done, like I said, just added a plane, but I just said, oh, whatever, I'll just leave it. It is what it is. So let's just pretend that that never happened. And now I just unfolded, laid out that whole group, and now I have each group UV'd and laid out. Now I just need to start planning out how I want to group these together. So depending on how many textures you have with this workflow in Substance, in your layers is going to separate your different textures. So now that's basically how I'm trying to think, is how am I going to group these together. So I'm just combining the groups together depending on how many textures I want. I decided I wanted two main textures, one for the main control panel and one for all the little stuff. So that's all I'm doing here. I just combined those two groups together, and now I'm just basically fitting both of those UVs together on the same UV map, in the same one-to-one space on the UV map. So I'm just going to straighten those out, fit this guy in, and then I have that little screen that I'm going to add later on. So I'm just messing around with these shapes and basically playing Tetris and trying to see how I can fit these together. And now always going back to my checkerboard to make sure everything's looking good. And now I'm just going through my other groups, deciding how I want this to look. And I'm just giving priority to obviously the bigger objects in my UV map, because I don't want to give, you know, that little bolt huge priority and then have that lever very small. The larger obviously it is on my UV map, the more resolution, the more detail I'm going to be able to retain. So keep that in mind as I'm positioning all of these shells around. And that's why the unfold works, or the layout, Control L, works so well, because it just gives priority to larger objects. But if I did this with everything, all of those bolts that I have layered on top of each other would also be spread out, which would then give me smaller spaces on my UV map, and I would just have less detail in my textures. So it's good to layer your UV shells where you can, just to save space in your UV map, have some little higher detail in your textures. In this case, I'm actually moving a few of the bolts actually off. Since I have three of them all beside each other, I know that when I add some dirt on top of that, they're going to be identical and it's going to be pretty obvious. So if you have extra space on your UV map and you can afford to use that space, use it. Like, use all of that space to your advantage, and especially in those areas like those bolts sitting beside each other. Since I have two literally right beside each other, it's better that I at least rotate them, or if I can, in an ideal world, have them covering different areas on the UV map, so I have different dirt and grunge effects on them. And it's going to help with that realism. So here I just decided that I'm going to combine all of those buttons onto this UV, this one texture. So I'm just combining these on, trying to fit them all in. I have a lot of space to work with, so I'm just trying to take advantage of them all. And then this is the outside of my buttons, so these can be all layered on top of each other. So I'm just going to squeeze these screws into some smaller areas to give room for these, and I can scale these nice and small. And like I mentioned, just try to use all of that UV space to your advantage. And just like that, boom, the second texture is together, so I can take all these folders, group them together, and for the sake of this video, we will just call one texture 1 and call the other texture 2. So now I have those grouped into my 2 groups. I can name it in my outliner, and I can open those and assign some textures. So the first one, we're just going to assign a blend. Now, depending on what you want, if it's going back into Maya, assign it as an Arnold. If it's going to Unreal, assign it to whatever. Like, I'm just using blend because I'm just going to do some quick renders out of Substance, so it doesn't really matter. But that is all good to go. We're ready to texture. Just kidding, we actually have a few small things to do. Now, really quickly before I exported, I thought I would add a few extra little details. There's always something that I feel like I should add extra. So one little detail I wanted to add was a little cube that's in the side of this card swipe. It was just looking too open, and there should be something in there. So I'm just gonna squish in a little cube to hopefully make it look a little bit more realistic. And obviously delete those unnecessary faces and then give it a small little bevel. Alright, we have that. Now I just want to add one more thing. Now I always like trying to add a personal touch to the model. If you can add something that looks like a human, actually, like it's not part of the object, but somebody put something there, for example, like a little marking or a note on a model. In this case, I thought it'd be cool to add a little piece of paper that has different codes for maybe different places that you can punch in on that keypad. So I thought I would add a little plane that's going to act as the piece of paper, and I can duplicate that same plane over as 2 little strips that are on each end. That's going to be tape holding that piece of paper on to this control panel. Once again, I always find it really helps bring the models to life if you can add a little bit of personal touch or a little bit of something that just gives it a little extra look, makes it look a little bit more realistic in the sense of like humans actually interacted with this, or something that helps serve a purpose for the model. I don't know, it just helps make it look a little bit more realistic, and these little things can really go a long way. So it was looking a little bit plain. I thought adding a little extra something would be nice. So now I have those positioned. I'm just adding a few extra edge loops on my pieces of tape so they're not perfectly straight, because no piece of tape would be perfectly straight. Almost everything actually is like slightly off. Just organic stuff like piece of tape and, you know. So we are just going to mess around with these vertices a little bit just to give it a little bit of extra shape. And I think that's gonna do. So all we're gonna do now is just, I wanna give a little bit of depth to this tape. I find if you leave it as a plane, sometimes you can see it's floating above that face and it just looks wrong. So I'm just gonna fit these planes as close as I can to this face using my other camera views to see how close I can get it. And then once I'm happy with that, I can just go ahead and just double click all of those outside edges and just extrude them downwards on my pieces of tape just to give them a little bit of depth. And you're probably going to be able to pick up that little depth in our renders when the light's hitting that edge, so just a little tiny thing to add a little bit more realism to it. Alright, so now quickly let's just UV these 2 things. For this little cube, let's just do an automatic. There's no point. It's such a simple shape, and actually all of these shapes we're going to do automatics. So we're just going to freeze transformation, center pivot, delete history, and then just do an automatic UV. And then I can just group all of those together. And I know I want the tape and the paper to be on the same texture map. So I'm just grouping that in. I know I have a little spot there in the top left corner that can fit this piece of paper, so I'm just gonna put it into that group and then just shrink it down to fit into my UV map. And like always, try to really use all that space that you can. So I'm just trying to maximize the space, and knowing that the bigger I make it, the more detail it's gonna have. So definitely use the space. You don't want to have any extra space sitting on the side that's not being used. Alright, so once I'm done these, I can just reassign those materials, those textures that I applied to these objects, and we're good to go. We're going to export this as an FBX, and then we can jump into Substance Painter and we can start texturing. Alright, so now jumping over to Substance Painter, I can go load in my FBX that we exported from Maya. Now you can choose a template if it was going somewhere specific, like Arnold. You could choose the PBR, Metallic, Unreal, depending where you're going. We're just going to leave this as is and press OK. Now once that model is all loaded in, we can take a quick look. And if everything looks good, you can go over to your texture set settings, scroll down to Bake Mesh Maps. You can choose your output size. I chose 4K. And make sure to check on that use low poly mesh as high poly mesh. And since we're feeling a little fancy today, we can move this anti-aliasing up to 4x4. If you're feeling extra fancy, put it up to 8x8. And since we're going this far, we can move all these rays. You can move those up to 200, 150. Just make sure to press apply to all, otherwise you're just going to be applied to the current texture that you're working on. Now this isn't necessary, I usually don't do this, but like I said, why not? I'm feeling a little fancy today. And once that looks good, we can just bake out those textures. Alright, so now we're ready to start texturing. So let's start with our texture one. I'm going to go over to my layers, and we can go to the Smart Materials tab and we can apply one of these Smart Materials. I'm going to go choose one of this plastic materials that comes already with a lot of grunge and dirt effects, which is kind of the route I had in mind. So we can just open up this folder and start tweaking some of these settings. Now one thing that jumps out to me is the grunge effects look like they're repeating a little bit just because of the size they are, so I can just open this folder, find the dirt material or grunge effect that I want to scale, and I can just scale that up or down just to make it not looking like it's repeating so much. Now I'm going to do the exact same thing for the other one. I'm just going to turn back or pull back that dirt effect a little bit just so it's not so obvious. We're going to add some other grunge effects later on, and then just mess around with a few of these settings until I find a good base that I'm happy with. So once we're happy with that, we can go ahead and right click, set that to a black mask, and then if I hit the little projection tool on the left and I go to Mesh Fill, I can choose whichever mesh I'd like to assign that material to. And this is how I always work in Substance. You can also choose that polygon fill, which I just switched to on the side here, and this is when it comes in handy depending on where you do the UV cuts. You can just apply these materials very quickly if you have everything prepped for you ahead of time. So now that that is looking good, I can go choose a different Smart Material, one of these steel matte textures, and I can apply that to the other meshes in my scene. Now all I have to do here is just open up that folder, go down, I want to make it a little bit more reflective, pull down that roughness value, and then I can tweak the color a little bit as well, just make it a little bit darker. And that's looking good, so we can right click, set that to a black mask like we did to the other one, and then since everything's set up, we can just go ahead and click whatever objects we want to assign that material to. Alright, so now I'm going to go add a fill layer. I want to add a little bit of grunge, and we're going to do that in the masks folder here, so I'm just going to drag on one of these mask effects onto my fill layer. Just keep clicking them on. I'm just trying a few different ones till I find something I'm happy with, and this one looks pretty good. So I can go in and just tweak some of these settings. You can just click and drag up and down the values depending on how much grunge and dirt you want to show. And I can switch over to the color and just basically go to a darker black color, and you'll just make it stand out. If I turn it on and off, you can see those dripping grunge effects on top. And that's looking pretty good. I just want to make this look a little bit more like dirt rather than just some like wet texture that's over top of it. So I'm just going to mess around with this roughness value a little bit until I find something that's a little bit more fitting. And I can go back up to that color and make it just a little bit more on the brown side. So it looks like there's a little bit of dirt that's all over the model. And that's looking good. The power of masks, they're pretty awesome. So I'm just going to jump back to that first material we applied and just make it a little bit more of a yellow rather than an orange. And we're looking good. So save the project. Can't tell you how many times in my life it's crashed other programs without saving, so definitely save. Now we can move on to that side little card swiper. I'm just going to add one of those steel stained, and just drag down the sliders a little bit to make it a little bit darker. Right click, set that as a black mask, and then assign it to the mesh. Pretty happy with that. I wanted that side little swiper, card swiper, to be a little different material than everything else. And now we can switch over to do my screen. So what I'm going to do is add a plastic material, and I am just going to set that to a black mask so I can assign it to that mesh. Now it's sitting on top of my grunge, so I'm just going to slide that directly below my layer so I have that dirt showing on top of that screen. So all I have to do here is just change the color. I want this to be a little darker red sort of color, and I want it to glow a little bit, especially that text we're going to have. So I need to go to my top right corner to my shader settings and switch it to alpha blending. That way when I scroll down and I go back to my texture set settings, I can hit that little plus and it'll allow me to add an emissive channel. So if I go back to my layers, I can actually toggle on this emissive slider, and I can just change the color of that emissiveness depending on whatever color you want to be glowing from it. You just have to remember to go back in your shader settings and just turn up that emissive intensity. And usually with this value you have to play around a little bit and jump into your render to see how it's looking, but that's good enough for now. We can always tweak those later on. So I'm just going to do the exact same process, add a different plastic material and turn that emissive slider on, and this is going to be my text on top of that. So I can make this a little bit brighter in red. Switch over to my alphas tab, and I can just scroll down to find whatever font that I think is fitting, and I can go just write in whatever information I got the idea from the actual reference photo, the system live, so we can go ahead and just paste that directly onto my screen. And now I can go back to that texture, change the emissive color depending on how much color and how much glowing effect I want to have from that. And then I can just go back and keep adding a few more words. So I just write random stuff that came across my mind, nothing in particular. But I'm just going to fill out this screen to add a little bit more detail, a little bit more words onto the screen. Alright, so the screen is looking good, all those words are applied. I end up removing one of them on the bottom, but it's looking good for now. We can always come back to it. So I'm just going to label it. Remember to label your layers. I'm really bad for that, but it makes your workflow a lot easier if you can just remember that. But the screen was looking a little bit too clean, so I wanted to go back to those textures folder and just drag on one of these textures right onto my roughness value. And you can play around with these different textures depending on whatever you want to show, but it's a cool way of getting some cool grunge effects and dirt effects on top of your material. Alright, so next up was going on to that little sticker, the little piece of paper that we had. So for the tape itself, I found this on Substance Source on their website. You can go download anything you like, drag it directly into your folder, and either assign it to your current session or to your whole library so you can use it for future projects. And that's what I do with this duct tape material. I use it all the time. I find this really cool. And it comes, like, you barely have to do anything to it. Just change some of that reflectivity, and I'm just basically just dragging the wrinkles depending on how many wrinkles I want to show in that texture, in that duct tape material. I'm just messing around with these sliders until I find something that's a little bit more fitting to what I had in mind. And since the color comes a little bit dark, I'm just gonna bump it up a little bit to make it stand out. Since it's sitting on a black piece of metal, I just want to make it a little bit more obvious that it's a light gray. So once I'm happy with that, I'm gonna go choose another paper material. Once again, another one I found on Substance Source on their website that I have just in my library. It's a really cool grid texture, so I'm just going to go in and tweak some of these settings to make those squares a little bit more obvious and just tone down that whiteness. It's a little bit too white. And then mess around with a few of the other settings till I find something that I'm happy with. And then once we're happy with it, right click, set it to a black mask, and assign it to that mesh. Now we just want to add some words over top, so similar to how we did the ones on the screen, I'm going to go choose one of these plastic materials I like to use. You could use a fill layer as well, but I just always use the plastics. And then choosing another alpha depending on whatever font I want to use. I can go choose one of those and start writing on some words and pasting them directly onto that mesh. Now for the text themselves, I didn't know exactly what I wanted to add. I just basically started thinking of various things. I was trying to think of where this object would be sitting in some sort of like, I don't know, secret factory or some sort of like, I don't even know, somewhere that's pretty important that has emergency levers on them. So I thought maybe office, lobbies, security, just various rooms would be fitting. So I'm just gonna go fill in this paper with various codes to different places, and then we can move on to the other meshes. Alright, so once those words are all applied, I can go change the color to a little bit of a dark since we don't want it light blue. And it's looking pretty good. You could even go in actually further and like using your eraser tool erase some of them to look marked up, but I just decided not to do it. It looks pretty good, so let's move on. Alright, so now we want to add a little bit more detail to that metal. So I want to add some cool bump effects into the metals themselves. So all we have to do is add a fill layer that's inside that metal folder. And I can click off all of those channels except for just the height channel since it's the only thing we want to affect. I can go choose one of those cool alphas. Just make sure to pull that height slider down depending on how deep you want that to be ingrained into that metal. And I can just start pasting on some cool alphas. So I thought a little screw alpha in all these corners would kind of be cool, so let's start pasting some cool stuff all over this model. Alright, so those screws definitely add something to it, and there's so many cool alphas in here. You can definitely get pretty crazy and add some really cool stuff to your meshes. So we're going to choose a couple other cool things just to populate it, make it look a little bit more busy. And they have this cool little square. I thought maybe underneath the lever just to add a little something underneath it. Maybe that could look cool. And I'm really just experimenting along the way, just trying new things. Sometimes it's worth just trying stuff and you don't really, some of the things you think wouldn't work actually look pretty good and you end up choosing it. So it's good to experiment and try different things out. Alright, so now I'm just going to unhide all the other objects to see how things are looking, and don't forget to save your project. And we're looking pretty good. Just the yellow is looking a little bit too clean, and I want to add a little bit more dirt effects. So like we did to the other ones, add another fill layer inside that yellow folder, and I can just drag on one of these masks depending on what sort of dirt effect I'm looking for. And then all I have to do is just change the color to a darker black. I can mess around with the reflectivity and the metallic depending on how I want it to look. And I usually just drastically drag the sliders to see how it affects it and then find something that I'm happy with. So feel free to experiment. That's the best way to find new things, and you always come across different ways of doing things. So now I don't want it applied to everything, so I'm going to quickly add a folder so I can drag this material mask I just created into the folder, and I can right click that folder, set that to a black mask, and assign just the yellow pieces. That way it's not affecting everything in my scene or all of my yellow pieces. It's affecting just that top bar that I basically clicked on. So just keep that in mind with masks. Sometimes you have to put them into folders so it's not affecting everything else. So now it's time to add a little bit of some words on top of that metal bar. So just like we did the other words, I'm going to add another plastic material, set that to a black mask. I can go choose a font that comes in Substance Painter, and I can start pasting on some words. So start filling up this top bar with a few words. I'm going to go off of that first reference photo we used. I really like what he did, and rather than just explore, I want to make this video as quick as I can. We're already over an hour and a half, so I got to put the pedal to the metal so we can wrap it up. So I'm just going to speed up this next little part of the video as I'm just adding these words to this top menu bar. And all I'm going to be doing is just choosing different alphas. They have some really cool like electricity warning symbols and danger words. So I'm just going to choose a couple of these so I can paste them on, and then we can move on to the other objects. Alright, so most of the text is applied to the model. Just that pull lever down text looks very, very clean. And I just want to basically just mess it up a little bit. So we're going to go to our eraser brush, find a cool dirt brush or whatever brush, and start erasing some of that text just to make it look a little bit more beaten up so it matches the other materials that are applied to the objects. Now this is something also I find the more different brushes you use and the more layering you do on top of each other, you really can start making it look realistic. So try not to always stick with one brush. In this case, I know I'm doing that, or I choose a couple different ones, but the more brushes you can use, the more realistic it's going to be, because just different wear and tears from different things nicking it. Add a few scratches, the little dots, just change it up, and you'll find the more you add to it, the more realistic it looks. And we're basically done with the texture one. All those materials are applied, it's looking good. So now let's just move on to our second texture. So what I'm going to do is just copy over that same yellow that we have applied on our first texture to our second, and then I can go just change some of the roughness and apply it to that one little handle on my lever. So now that the yellow is applied, I want to find some sort of black caution stripes we can basically print right over top of this yellow. So I'm going to go choose a base material for those stripes themselves. And I'm going to use the same steel material that we applied earlier, just so it's all consistent and it looks the same. I can right click, set that to a black mask, go over to my alphas tab, and I can go choose one of these stripe alphas. Now, the one that comes with Substance Painter is a little thin, so I'm gonna have to just work my way around trying to figure this out. So as you can see right now, if I just paste this right onto my mesh, you can see it wraps around. So I have to scroll down to my alignment and switch that over to UV. That way when I paste it onto my UVs, it's gonna just be proper and it's not gonna actually wrap around it. So now it's just a matter of lining these up. You could, in a perfect way, hop into Photoshop, you can make an alpha that's much wider and you don't have to do this, but since this is so thin, I'm just gonna have to eyeball it and just make sure, just kind of line them up so it looks like they're lined up, and to be honest, you won't be able to tell, so we'll just do something like this. And that's looking pretty good. Like I said, you can always create your own alpha to make your life a little bit easier, but we're using all the built-in stuff, so it is what it is. So once I'm happy with that, it's looking a little bit too clean, and that's just because I copied over the wrong yellow material. So I copied over that clean one from the text, so we're gonna jump down to that plastic grungy one that we first applied. I can just copy that over and replace it with that same yellow material we applied to the lever. And that's looking much better. It already looks a little bit dirtier, not as perfect. So we can start applying some more materials to these other meshes. So I'm going to go back to my Smart Materials tab, and I'm going to choose a different steel texture. I want it to be a little bit different than the other steels that we have applied. I just don't want it to basically like blend in so much. I want to make it a little bit brighter so it stands out and just looks like it's a different metal texture that's actually applied to it. I find if you can have too much of the same consistent materials, it looks too plain. And if you can have some variations in there, some different varieties of metals, it starts to look really cool. And once that looks good, we can right click, set it to a black mask, and assign it to those meshes. So next up is doing all of those screws. Now I want to have, once again, a different type of metal. So we're just going to use one of those steel ruined textures that come with Substance, and I'm going to apply it to the other bolts and the little cylinder that's holding the lever in place. And we're looking good. So we're almost there. We just have a few other meshes to apply some materials to. So next up were the wires. I'm just going to use that rubber tire texture that comes with Substance in their Smart Materials tab. And I'm just going to apply one to each wire, one being each different color. So all I'm going to do is just apply the same texture, but just change the color and just click a different wire. So I have 3 different colors. Just add a little bit more color to the model. Just change it up a little bit and add a little something. I originally was thinking all black, but once again, I think it would just blend in too much. So throwing in like a blue color or something different would just make it stand out a little bit more. Alright, so the wires look good. Next up is the buttons. So same thing, I'm going to go choose rubber material for the buttons themselves. And I can open that up and just tweak some of the settings depending on how reflective I want those buttons to show. And once again, working with black masks, we can right click, set it to a black mask, and assign it to all of those little button meshes. Alright, so next up is just doing the letters that are on, or the numbers on top of those buttons. So just like we did the other ones, I'm going to choose a plastic material as my base, set that to a black mask. I can go just change that from a blue to a nice white or grayish white, and I just make sure to click on the emissive. You have to add an emissive channel. Since we didn't do it to this texture set, I have to go to my texture set settings, hit the plus icon just like we did to the first texture. And then once that emissiveness is applied, I can go swap back to that material and choose the alpha that you want for the text, and then I can go in and then just paste on these numbers directly onto my buttons. Now because my orientation of them on my UV map, it made it a little bit harder than it should be. In a perfect world, they're all facing the exact same way, so I could just paste on these numbers just really easily. Because some of them are facing in different directions and I didn't check that before I exported the model, I just need to keep changing the direction of my numbers so they're all facing upright. So let's go ahead and start pasting on these numbers onto these buttons. Alright, so the buttons are done, it's looking good. There's just a few extra details I want to add. Now looking at the model, I thought there should be a little speaker of some sorts. So we're going to add a little plastic material like we did find in alpha. And they have these little 5 dots alpha that's going to work. All I have to do is add a height channel, drag that height slider low so it's imprinted, and then it looks like I have a little imprint of a speaker into the model. And now the same thing, I was looking at those numbers and they're looking really flat since I had to know geometry, like some imprints into the metal themselves. So we're gonna fake that into the material. So exactly like I did that speaker, I'm just gonna choose a square as my alpha, and I can just roughly start pasting on or drawing right below those buttons to give a little bit of depth where those buttons would be. Now I do this very quickly, and to be honest with you, I do a really bad sloppy job. You could just take your time and do it properly and it would look a little bit better. Especially that bottom row, I just rush it and I just don't do a really good job. But it's just a really quick way of adding a little bit of depth behind those buttons so it's not looking so flat. Just because I didn't add that depth into the geometry itself, it just gives a way of adding a little bit more realism so it's not looking like it's hovering or sitting right on top of the metal. Now I'm just jumping back and tweaking some of these colors and a few of the settings. At this point you can really see what stands out, so that yellow, I'm just toning it back a little bit to more of a yellow color rather than orange. And just messing around with some of that grunginess on top of my screen. Just messing around with some of these settings that I currently have applied. Now I wanted to add a little bit more grunge, just a little bit different variations of different grunge effects. So I thought it would be cool adding a little bit of, a little bit more dirt, little specks. So I chose a more of a mask that has more dots, that's not as like crazy dirt. And that way I can add a little bit, a few dots on top. It's like another layer of dirt on top of it. So now quickly jumping into my renderer to take a look at it, I'm going to turn off my background, remove the ground since I don't need it, and take a look at the model. I can just go through these different environment maps, changing the lightings just to see how those materials are looking. And usually when I jump in the first time, a few things jump out that I want to fix right off the bat. So it's a good way of just seeing how things are looking, because they always look different in your renderer than they do in your editor. Now there's a few things you could do, like adding some vignette or adding some cool post-processing effects. We're not going to do any of that in this render. I like to do all that in Photoshop at the end. That way you can change your backgrounds and add your own vignette or other cool effects. So we're going to jump back into the editor so I can make a few small tweaks. So one of the things I thought I would add, which is a cool way of adding a little bit more detail, is going to that height channel that we applied where those imprints in our metal. And we can go find a different dirt brush and actually paint on some dirt effects. Because we have that height slider applied, it's going to look like it's imprinted into our metal material. So a cool way of doing that is just, go over the top and draw it on, and then with the eraser tool you can pull it back, and you can just play around with different brush effects and have some cool different cracks and little imprints in your metal. That's going to make it look a little bit more realistic without adding other more grunge effects on top. Because sometimes if you add too many grunge effects and masks, it starts looking like it's like you threw dirt all over it, and we want to go too crazy, but just adding these little bump effects can really make your model look more realistic. And as well as those buttons, they were looking a little bit too clean. So I'm just going to go to that rubber material that we have applied, and I'm just going to open that folder and add a fill layer so we can add a different masking effect to add a little bit of edge wear on those buttons. And now jumping back into the render to see how things are looking, and just changing around, messing around with the lighting effects just to find something that I'm happy with. And this screen was bugging me for some reason. I don't know why, I wasn't happy with it. So I decided to add another fill layer and add a different masking effect over top of that, and just experimenting with a few different things to see what I find works better. I thought that this was working a little bit better. It made it a little bit more reflective. So now jumping back in the render, I noticed I missed these two other buttons on the bottom. So similar to how we did all the other ones, we're just gonna go paste a few different words onto these ones. Now keep in mind, you can go change that emissive slider if you want these buttons to glow a little bit more. In this case, I didn't want them to glow too much, I just wanted them to be a little bit brighter than your typical material that was applied, like I pasted on those letters. So while looking at it, I also forgot I wanted to add, and this was from that second image, they had this cool like insert keycard text on the bottom with two arrows, and I thought that'd be fitting to add a little extra something on the model. So I'm just going to open up that same folder that we applied the pull lever down text to and just repaste on different words on the side there. And then once again, just adding more grunge effects to different objects. I'm opening up other folders like that metal that we have applied to the handle on the lever, and I'm just adding another fill layer inside there to add some more grunge effect on top of that mesh. So I just don't want some parts looking too clean because it looks fairly beaten up. So all the other meshes around it should be all fitting the same scene, like they all come from the same place. And at this point, it's just jumping back and forth, going into the renderer, noticing something and jumping back. And this is honestly one of the longer parts of the texturing process I find, is this final tweaks. You can be jumping back and forth constantly for really as long as you want to finalize everything. So we're not going to spend too long. All I'm doing here is just adding a few extra little crack effects into the metal, and just so it doesn't look too plain. I find if you use just one grunge effect so it looks too consistent, you want to have different variations. So here I'm just adding another very small amount of dirt so I can add just a little bit brighter of a metal texture. Like it's not actually dirt, it's like a metal that's scratching through. Or you can add different grunge effects and change the colors of those so it looks like there's different kinds of dirt on top of them, or you can really experiment and get pretty crazy. So have some fun, try new things, and you always come across some cool stuff that you normally wouldn't think would be fitting just by experimenting. Alright, so that's basically everything. That's the whole texturing, modeling, and UVing process that I did to create this little emergency switchboard thing. I hope you guys liked the video. If you did, give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more weekly 3D content. Also, let me know what you guys thought of the video. I know it was a lot different than usual, being a lot slower paced and a lot longer in length, but I'm hoping it was a lot easier to follow along for a lot of the beginners out there, and maybe you guys even learned a thing or two. If you'd like to support the channel even further, as well as get access to additional content, check out my Patreon page, which I will link in the description below. Anyways, thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.